And now joining us on Book TV is John Taylor. His most recent book is right here, First Principles, 5 Keys to Restoring America's Prosperity. Secretary Taylor, before we get started on the book, why don't you give everyone a primer of your government service so they have an idea of where you're coming from?
Well, I've been fortunate to have a number of stints in government. One actually is way back when in the U.S. Navy, after I graduated from college, but then I served in the Council of Economic Advisors with President Ford and then a little bit with President Carter, and then came back on the Council of Economic Advisors with President Bush 41, and then spent most recently a little over 4 years as Undersecretary of the Treasury.
Under President Bush 43.
President Bush 43, yes.
What did you learn from your government experience?
Well, I learned how important it is to get the economics right and how difficult it is to get the economics right. I've been interested in economics because of its public policy applications, and it's one of the reasons I've taken these opportunities. The ideas are difficult, and they're even more difficult to get enacted, I feel like. So to me, the challenge and the fascinating part of economics is getting the policy to coincide with the principles.
John Taylor, in your government experience in the macro sense, what do you think you got right, and what do you think you didn't get so right?
I think over the long haul, what we got right was what happened mostly in the 80s and 90s until recently. We learned from the 70s. I served in the Ford and the Carter administration. That was a period where there were a lot of unfortunate outcomes. Unemployment started to go up, inflation started to go up, growth started to slow down, and I think the policies were not appropriate. So what I learned, and what many people learned, is if we had a different kind of policies, and that began in the late 70s and continued, I think, until recently, a good 25 years, things worked well. Now we're sort of off track again. And that's what I've learned in practice, seeing a little bit about how policy gets made, and I think it reaffirms a lot of economic ideas that I've been talking about for a while.
Well, what are the first principles? What are these 5 keys that you speak of?
Well, the basic idea is the principles of economic freedom, I call them, and it's the kind of principles I've been teaching my students for a long time. It's the idea that people have the opportunity to decide what to buy, what to sell, where to work, how to help other people, but within a framework of 5 principles. One is predictable policy. Second is the rule of law. Third is an emphasis on markets. Fourth is the incentives that people have largely come from markets. And number 5 is a limited scope for government. And by limited, I mean an analysis of where government should play the role and where government should not play a role in the market, and getting that right.
Is one more important than another?
Well, I think they're all important. What I would say is over the years, economists have learned that the first 2 are more important than we thought. And that's why I start with those 2. We tended to forget them, the predictability of policy, so that people know what the game is, what's going to happen with tax policy, what's going to happen with monetary policy, interest rates. And also the rule of law. I think economists didn't emphasize how important the rule of law was until relatively recently. We've learned that. But to me, those are the hardest 2 things to teach students. Markets, reasonably easy. Incentives, reasonably easy. Scope for government goes back many years. But those 2 I stress because they're not emphasized enough.
And are those 2 principles that we've been discussing the last couple of years in Washington, trying to get the budget right, trying to get a tax policy right?
Absolutely. You've seen, in a sense, some of the dangers of unpredictable policy. People don't know what's going to happen to the deficit and the debt, and there's been a lot of quarreling about that. It seems quite unpredictable or uncertain. Many people, including myself, think that's one of the reasons the economy hasn't gone so well. On the rule of law, you see examples where, for example, on the bailouts of financial institutions, we helped others and not everyone, if you like, and that sort of questions how the rule of law has operated.
John Taylor, the fact that you make those the first 2 rules, does that say in any way that we are too dependent on government when it comes to economic policy?
I would say we have gotten a little too dependent, if you like. People are beginning to expect more, I think, than the government can deliver, at least in the way it's been doing this. What's best, as I can see, it's, say, for example, the rule of law, is it's clear what is going to happen if you take this action or that action. Or if there's a regulatory rule for financial institutions that they shouldn't take so much risk or they should have capital, that those rules will be enforced by the regulators and you won't have special favors or privileges to others. So it's not so much dependent on government run well. I think it's a concern that we're depending on government that isn't running so well.
What happened in '08, in your view? What went wrong?
Well, leading up to it, you can't just start with '08, that's when it happened. Leading up to it, I think I would point to two main things. One is the Federal Reserve in 2003 and 4 or 5 decided to hold interest rates very low. That caused people to what we call search for yield, to try to get higher interest rates. They took on risk, banks, financial institutions, and it also caused this boom in the housing market. And ultimately the boom turned into a bust, and people saw the extra risk it was taking, and that led to the crisis and ultimately to the panic in 2008.
What about the tax cuts in the early part of the first Bush administration, or Bush 43, the first term? We hear often on our call-in programs on C-SPAN that President Clinton left President Bush with a surplus and he squandered it.
President Clinton certainly did leave President Bush and the economy with a surplus. A big reason for that is he brought spending down during the 90s. As a share of GDP, spending fell by 4.1% of GDP, 4.1 percentage points during the 1990s. And that enabled us to have a surplus. In the 90s, federal spending has reversed that completely as a share of GDP. It got up as high as 25%. From 18.2 in 2000. So it seems to me that one way we've gone wrong here is that we have ratcheted up spending as a share of GDP more than is sustainable.
Should those tax cuts have taken place?
I think the permanent tax cuts were good to do. They helped the economy. I quarrel with these temporary tax cuts in 2008, for example. There was part of the stimulus trying to get the economy going, but everything I see is reducing the top tax rates, reducing the lowest tax rates. Remember, we took the lowest tax rate from 15% to 10%, trying to reduce those taxes on people across the board. I think that was healthy and it helped people out. The real problem is we didn't control spending, and it's gotten worse.
And John Taylor writes about that time when he was serving as Undersecretary of the Treasury from 2001 to 2005 in First Principles, 5 Keys to Restoring America's Prosperity. Secretary Taylor, you also write about what you call the Nixon shock. What is that?
Well, amazingly, in 1973, President Nixon imposed wage and price controls on the entire economy, sort of the reverse of a market approach. And I think that really was a shock. It wasn't expected. It was a factor in the poor economic performance that really lasted throughout the 70s. It led to other problems. It made monetary policy too easy because the Fed could say, hey, we don't have to worry about inflation for a while. We've got everything frozen. And that monetary policy ultimately, because you couldn't have wage and price controls forever, led to this high inflation. So is an example of a deviation from these principles that I emphasize so much. And in that case, first of all, it's completely unpredictable. But second, it really went away from the idea of markets being able to provide incentives for people. We lost that.
When you write about crony capitalism in First Principles, what are you writing about?
It's largely in the financial sector that I've focused on. I think it's broader than that. One example would be the case where the banks had a lot of regulators, supervisors, many on the premises of the major Wall Street banks who somehow didn't see the actions that were taken. That's kind of an example where why that happened, we don't know. Another term for this is